All right, we're ready for James chapter 3. We've been a couple of weeks. Last week was our gospel meeting with David Eldridge. And so we've been out of pocket as far as the class is concerned. And we've looked at James chapters 1 and 2, and a little reminder of what the chapters of this book is about. It deals with active faith. In every chapter, there's something said about an active faith, even in this chapter, chapter 3. And so everything relates somehow to an active faith. I think even the first part of the chapter does. We'll talk about that in a moment. But chapter 3, verse 13, we show wisdom by good conduct, agrees with this principle of having an active faith. Not just having faith, but faith must be active. Again, every chapter deals with that and touches upon that. Now, here's chapter 1. Chapter 1 dealt with trials and temptations and how they're for our good, and God helps us in the midst of that. We're to continue in our faith through, even though we're tempted and tried, etc. Chapter 2 dealt with faith and works, and dealt with respect to person doesn't harmonize with faith. Faith requires obedience to the whole law, and faith without works is dead. So those deal again with an active faith. Chapter 3 does much the same. Some commentators make the observation that we have an abrupt shift in gears in chapter 3. And I agree with that in part. We do have a shift, but it still has a connection to this concept of an active faith, and I hope to demonstrate that as we go further. I think chapter 3 still is connected with faith and works and an active faith. And even those whose work involves, such as teachers of verse 1, the teacher of verse 13, even that person whose work involves words requires them to have a connection between an active faith. We're going to see that, I think, as we go further. In chapter 3, I call it simply controlling the tongue and the use of wisdom. Two major thoughts. 1 to 12 is controlling the tongue, and then 13 to 18 has to do with wisdom. They are laced together. They are fitting together, though those are two independent thoughts found in the chapter. But also this chapter deals with teachers. And everything in the chapter, wisdom at the end, controlling the tongue, relates also to teachers, though in principle it applies to all of us. You say, why do you say it talks about teachers? Well, look at verse 1. Let not many of you become teachers. Let's get ahead and get to verse 13. Well, obviously, before I leave verse 1, teachers refers to teachers. So that's why I think it deals with teachers. Now, verse 13, who is wise and understanding among you, I think literally refers to a skilled teacher. He's wise, he's skilled, has understanding, he's a skilled teacher. And that connects back to verse 1, the one who thinks, I am a skilled teacher. I'm not like the one you warn about in verse 1 or in verse 12, or verses 1 through 12. We'll come to that in just a moment. So the principle directly and specifically applies to those who would be self-proclaimed teachers. Who is being addressed? In other words, who is someone, is James addressing someone who has, in some of the churches where this letter may arise, is he dealing with a specific problem or is he dealing with a general potential problem? I'm not sure. We're not told. But perhaps there is something that caused James to think, I need to address this matter of those who claim to be teachers or those who want to be teachers, and there needs to be a warning about that. We'll say more about that when we get to verse 1. So that's that's a summary of chapter 3. Two major thoughts, controlling the tongue and use of wisdom. We've tried to give a key verse each time, so here's a key verse for chapter 3. I think it would be verse 2. For we stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect or mature man, also able to bridle the whole body. I think that would apply. The principle of verse 2 would have some implication to verses 13 to 18. Questions, comments on where we're going, what the chapter's about, how it fits with the book, how it relates to chapters 1 and 2 before we begin to roll through the chapter. All right, let's look at verses 1 to 12, controlling the tongue. And you may be following some study guide or commentator, and that's well and good. We're talking about some of those tools in our Wednesday night study. And I'm following some of those and using some of those. But some of the commentators group verse 1 to itself as a standalone verse, kind of, as some have called the book of James, the book, New Testament book of Proverbs. There are standalone verses that this subject is not dealt with in the following verses, doesn't even relate to that. And that's kind of how some commentators deal with this to some degree, that verse 1 is a standalone verse dealing with teachers, and then the tongue is dealt with in verses 2 through 12. I group verses 1 to 12 together because I think this is part of the responsibility of the tongue. And so I throw those possibilities out there and you can do with it what you wish. So let's begin to roll through the chapter now. He's dealing with the tongue. Everything relates to the tongue in verses 1 to 12. Is this the first time James has talked to us about the tongue? Got a 50-50 chance of getting it right because it's either yes or no. Yes, chapter 1, verse 19 and 26. All right. Be swift to hear, slow to speak, verse 19. And if anyone seems to be religious, verse 26, and doesn't bridle his tongue, this man's religion is vain. So this is not the first time he's talked about the tongue. And the tongue must relate somehow to an active faith, because that's the theme of the book, seemingly. And so he's already touched on that, and he's touching on it again a little more thoroughly here. So let's see what he says. Verse 1, I just simply label that as being, we're responsible for what we say. And again, this applies to teachers, but the principle is true for all of us in everything we say and do. My justification for that would be Jesus' statement in Matthew 12, by your words, finish the quotation, by your words you are justified, and by your words you shall be condemned. All right. We can be justified or condemned by the words that we utter. Remember that? Matthew chapter 12. I believe it's verse 30 and 31. So let's get verse 1. Brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing you shall receive a stricter judgment. One translation says a greater condemnation. Let's start with question number 1, then we come back to the verse. Why does James say, let not many of you become teachers? All right. Very good.
All of us are commanded to teach, go out to the world and be examples. So we teach that way. But when you become a teacher, it's more of a great responsibility because you can turn many people away.
All right. That's good. What else? All right. Now let's go back. These are all good comments. Let's go back to what Kevin just said. All of us, if you didn't catch what he said, all of us have a responsibility to teach in some shape, form, or fashion. The Great Commission wasn't given to the church. It's given to us as individuals. So all of us have a responsibility to teach. We're to teach by example. We're to teach by instruction. So and there is a sense in which all of us teach. I think here he's more talking about a public proclaimer. Be not many teachers. In other words, let's paraphrase that. He's saying, in essence, not everybody needs to jump into the role of teaching. Now, why? All right. Not everybody has the ability to teach. Remember, Paul talked to Timothy about the qualifications of those who are to preach or to teach, whether it's a Bible class teacher or teaching the gospel in any form. 2 Timothy 2:2. They're to be faithful, number 1, and number 2, they're to have the ability to teach. Not everybody has the ability. Not everybody has the knowledge. Could a person have knowledge and not have the ability to communicate? Sure. So what he's saying, not everybody needs to be in the role of teaching. Not everybody needs to do that because of the weighty responsibility. That's the point of the end of the verse, knowing he shall receive a stricter judgment. What's the idea of a stricter judgment? Yeah, make sure you're taking it in context, not out of context. Do we do a disservice to the church and to the individual when we tell practically every man, as soon as he comes out of the water, you need to start doing invitations, you need to start teaching Bible class, you need to get in the pulpit and preach? Is that good advice? Not good advice at all. Not everybody needs to preach, not everybody needs to teach, not everybody needs to do an invitation, because not everybody's cut out for that. That doesn't mean they're inferior. It just means not everybody needs to be a teacher. The stricter judgment has to do with he's going to have to give an account. It's a weighty responsibility for the things he says. That's the point we're making here. You're responsible for what you say. And so you could mislead someone. You could misguide someone. You could abuse the text and teach something that is not correct. Is that possible? Certainly so. Any other comments on verse 1? Yes, ma'am. Good point. Good point. There are different levels of teaching. And just because one's not skilled now doesn't mean they can't be skilled in the future. Excellent point. Not everybody's cut out for that. But here's the point I want you to see. We are responsible for what we say. And so does that apply to teachers? Well, he applies it right here to teachers. Does that apply in general to everything we say? Certainly so. So control your tongue because you're responsible for what you say. That's what we're going to take home in a practical sense. Now let's begin at verse 2 and look at 2 to 4. The tongue controls the whole body. The tongue controls the whole body. Now let's get the verses and then we'll come back and see how the tongue controls the body. For we all stumble in many things. What does that mean? We all make mistakes. We all sin. In fact, we do so in many things. And if one does not stumble in word, what does that mean? With his, all right, say something amiss, say something wrong, make a mistake with what we say the wrong thing. If you don't stumble in word, he is a perfect man. What does the word perfect mean here? Mature. Your footnote will say mature in the New King James. That's what the word means. Almost always, if not always, the term perfect means mature in the New Testament. I don't know of an exception. I'm not saying there's not one. I'm just saying all these years I haven't found it. You may find it. Have at it. But it means mature. He is not saying if you don't stumble, you are flawless. What he's saying is, we all stumble in many things. That happens from time to time, even with our tongue. But the person who can control his tongue is a mature person. Does that make sense? That's his point. Now let's get verse, and he is also able to bridle the whole body. What does that mean? Say again? Yeah. I think what he's saying is if you can control the tongue, then you're able to control the whole body. I don't think he's saying that if you control the tongue, then don't worry about anything else. The rest of your body's being controlled. Is it possible one could control their tongue and yet sin in other areas with their body? Well, sure. But I think he's saying the tongue is so hard to tame, the tongue is so hard to control, that if you're able to control the tongue, you're not flawless, you're mature. And that mature person is able to control the rest of their body. So they can control their thoughts, their desires, everything else that their body may do. Make sense? All right, let's go further. Let's get verse 3 and 4, and we need to pick up our pace and move on. He gives two illustrations here. What's the first in verse 3? Controlling a horse. We put a bit in the horse's mouth, but we only control his mouth, right? His whole body. You can put his feet where you want to put his feet. You can put his whole body wherever you want to put it by controlling that with that bit. And that's, by the way, against the will of the animal. The animal may want to go this direction, but with that bit you can control him and make him go in a different direction. All right? Here's a second illustration. Verse 4, what's it? Giant ship is controlled by the little rudder, and it goes wherever the pilot wants it to go, against the force of the winds. Now, it's interesting, in both illustrations, there is pressure going in the opposite direction, but you can take that bit and control the horse, and the wind is blowing in one direction, but you can control it and go in another direction. Make sense? So is it easy to control the tongue? No. It's going to go against forces and going to go against all kinds of will that's going in the opposite direction. Here's his point, though. You can control the whole ship, you can control the whole horse, and if you can control the tongue, you can control the whole body, the whole man. All right? Self-denial, self-control. Let's get 5 and 6. He talks about it being capable of great things. What's the point at verse 5? Yeah. It's capable of doing great things. It's like a little spark. Look at verse 5. Verse 5 says, even so the tongue is a little member, boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. A little spark, a little bitty fire, can cause a whole forest to enrage. Started with that little fire. The tongue can do great destruction. It's a small member. What does verse 6 say? All right. What else?
The tongue can destroy your whole body.
It can. Look at verse 6. The tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. In other words, it can do great harm, is the idea. The tongue is set on fire, is set among our members that defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature. In other words, it has a powerful effect, is the point being made, and is set on fire by the course of nature and is set on fire by hell. I was going to give you a couple of translations that may help us here at verse 6. The New Century Version, the tongue is like a fire. It is a whole world of evil among the parts of our bodies. The tongue spreads its evil through the whole body. The tongue is set on fire by hell, and it starts a fire that influences all of life. I like that. As we've been talking on Wednesday night, some of these looser translations are not accurate to the T, but sometimes their summary, their paraphrase, gets to the heart. I'll read that again. I think this gets to the point of what the tongue is like a fire. It's a whole world of evil among the parts of our bodies. The tongue spreads its evil through the whole body. It is set on fire by hell. That's Gehenna, by the way. And it starts a fire that influences all of life. In other words, it can do damage that affects your whole life. It affects your business. It affects your home life. It affects the church. It affects the nation. Affects the neighborhood. Affects relationships. Make sense? Yes, sir.
I think too, in part on this, what we're talking about, is we need to think on godly things and not on earthly things.
Good point. Good point. Let's talk about verses 7 and 8 now. 7 and 8 is the point being made is the tongue is hard to control. Is there a difference in being hard to control and impossible to control? Absolutely. For every kind of beast and reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and is tamed by mankind. What's the point?
Man controls all of the beasts and animals of the earth, but he has more trouble controlling his own tongue than he would anything that God has created.
Yeah. We can take great, but you could take a lion and put it through training and train it to do whatever you want it to do. Do the same thing with an elephant. You can do it with all kinds of animals to train them to do whatever you want them to do at command. And they do exactly what you tell them to do. But now notice it, verse 8. But the tongue can no man tame. Now stop there for a moment. What does it mean? You can't tame it. I thought we're supposed to control it.
I don't think it's saying you can't tame it. It's hard. It's always right there on the edge of doing something you shouldn't say or do.
All right. So look at that phrase again. But the tongue can no man tame. Now there's a reason for that. Let's get the reason and we'll come back to that phrase. It's an unruly evil full of deadly poison. The unruly evil and the full of deadly poison, I think, has to do with the effect it has on the victim of your speech. It's poisonous. It's like dishing out poison. And we wouldn't think of handing out poison to people and say, here, take a dose of this. Here, take a drop of this. But we'll say things that have the same kind of effect. Let's go back to the first part of the verse. The tongue can no man tame. I think his point is you can never fully trust it. You can put a bit in a horse's mouth and you can control him. You can even train a horse to where you can take the bridle off and you can ride him without a bridle. You can do that. It takes work, but you can do that. But can you ever fully trust that animal where you can turn your back and say, I trust him fully? No. And you can't do that with, and so the point is the tongue can no man fully trust. You can't turn it loose and say, I'll trust the tongue to say whatever it wants and whatever it does and it's going to be okay. You've got to keep that bridle on. You've got to hold a tight rein. That makes sense. The tongue can no man tame. You can never tame it to the point that it's fully under control. You are to control it, but it takes work. In other words, it's hard to control. That's the point being made. Now let's get verses 9 through 12. There's contradictory uses of the tongue. And so, verse 9, with it we bless God the Father, and with it we curse men which are made in the likeness of God. The idea of cursing men may have to do with saying curse words to them, but I think it more has to do with pronouncing curses upon them or pronouncing for God's wrath to be upon them. In other words, we look with our tongue, we look up to God in praise, and then with that same tongue, we look down upon man in disarray and in dishonor. And so he's saying that those are contradictory uses. Out of the same mouth proceeds both blessings and cursing, and this ought not so to be. Now, what's his illustration in verse 11? 10, rather. Verse 11, I'm sorry. And 12. All right, yeah, the spring doesn't produce two kinds of water out of the same spring. You don't go to a spring and say, well, you know what? On this side of that same spring is coming fresh water, and over here it's salt water.
Well, that's the same with people. We should have a good attitude, but yet have, a bad attitude coming out of the same.
Absolutely, absolutely. His second illustration, verse 12, what's it? Yeah. You don't have a fig tree, and it also produced figs and at the same time olives. And the grapevine doesn't bear grapes and figs. So you can't take your tongue and praise God, and God be pleased, and at the same time curse men or defame or slander, which we're going to get to a little bit later in the book, as we're going to see in chapter 4. And that's why I think he's probably got slander here in mind. All right, contradictory uses. Now let's see. Any questions or comments? I'm going to go to question 3 here in just a moment. Yes, ma'am.
Is this less about the tongue and more about our thoughts? That we're supposed to be remaking ourselves at the mind of Christ. And if we do that, then what's going to come out of us is what's in our hearts. And if we don't do that, if we don't mind it, then what's going to come out is the blessing of the person.
All right. Good observation. Let's go to question number 3. Read verses 1 to 12 carefully. James lists some reasons why we should control the tongue. Make a list of the reasons you see. Why should we control the tongue? Say again.
It is a command of
It's God. It's a command of God. Very good. What else?
Be judged by what we say.
We're going to be judged by what we say. What else? Why do I need to control my tongue? Say again. Affects others? Because of the influence we have on others? Very good. Anything else?
You can condemn yourself with the tongue.
Absolutely. You sure can. Matthew 12, Jesus talks about that.
That's what I think sometimes what you say might be true, but it might not be the right thing.
Yeah. You're right. They may be an idiot, but you don't have to tell them that. Good point. Anything else on question 3?
I think it's a great warning.
Absolutely, it is a great warning. Controlling the tongue. More could be said about verses 1 to 12. We're responsible for what we say. It controls the whole body. It's capable of great things. It's hard to control. There's contradictory uses. If we walk away with anything practical, I think it's this, that it takes work to control the tongue. Evidence is right here in this text. Evidence is also in Proverbs. Proverbs, nearly every chapter of Proverbs has something about the tongue. Not every one, but almost every chapter has something about the tongue, which tells us it must be hard to control. Let's talk about the use of wisdom here in verses 13 to 18. Who is wise and understanding among you? The idea of wise suggests couple of references. King and Woods both make an observation. The word wise stands for teacher or refers to teacher. And perhaps alludes back to verse 1, the teacher that was introduced at verse 1. And so having dealt with the tongue and controlling the tongue, then who is wise and understanding among you? Here's a well-meaning teacher who perhaps thinks some of the warnings of verses 1 to 12 may not apply to him. That all is well and good for the teacher that's not wise, but I'm wise. And I'm a skilled teacher. Literally, the wise and understanding among you is a skilled teacher. Who is the skilled teacher among you? Well, here's the first point. He says, show your wisdom in works. Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in meekness of wisdom. What does that mean?
Humility that comes from wisdom.
All right, humility that comes from wisdom. Remember when Wednesday night we've talked about this word meek several times. We've illustrated how that some original words cannot be translated with one word. There's a whole passel of terms that go with that. Meekness is one of them, the word translated meekness. It involves gentleness, it involves humility, it involves strength under control, et cetera, et cetera. So there's several things involved. So this idea of meekness at least involves the concept of humility as part of that. So the person who claims to be wise, let him show by good conduct that his works are done, not just in wisdom, but in meekness or humility of wisdom. Does that make sense? So here's what I'm learning from that. Wisdom is demonstrated in our actions. That's quite simplistic. How many times have you had someone come to you and give you advice? And I'm going to kind of exaggerate just for emphasis, but in essence, this is how it comes across. You need to listen to me because I have some wisdom. I know what I'm talking about. I have wisdom. I've been around the block. I know what's going on. I have some wisdom and you need to listen to me. How does that fit with this text? All right, not being meek, maybe. Absolutely. If you have wisdom, you don't have to tell people. It's going to show. They're going to know you have wisdom. So if I've got to tell you, you know what? Y'all need to listen to me because I've got some wisdom, then I must be questioning whether you notice it or not. If I have wisdom, it shows. If you have wisdom, it shows. So the wise and skilled teacher, we're going to know he's wise. How we know he's wise? Not by what he says, but by his conduct, his action, the way he lives, the way he conducts himself. And so you say, well, what's he talking about? Well, he's about to tell us, 14 to 18. So here's some things we learn. If wisdom is from below, the works will be evil. If wisdom is from above, it'll be good works. Our actions tell whether we're listening to God or listening to the devil. We show our wisdom in our works. That's where the theme comes back into play here. That is faith in works, active faith. Make sense? All right. Now then, 14 to 16, he talks about wisdom from below. This person who may be proclaiming to be a teacher may be using wisdom from below. He's got wisdom all right, but it's the wrong source of wisdom. So let's see what he says about this source of wisdom. In the interest of time, we're going to look at a contrast here. This is wisdom from below. We're going to see the nature, the works, what it does, and then the results that come. Let's see. Starting at verse 14. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. I'll come back to that. This wisdom does not descend from above, but it is earthly, that is worldly, sensual, animal-like. That's not sexual, sensual in that sense, but it's animal-like behavior, and demonic, meaning it came from Satan rather than from God. For where envy and self-seeking exist, here's a description of what's going on. Where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing will be there. Now let's get the picture of what we just saw in 14 to 16. What's the nature of the wisdom that doesn't come from God? Well, it's earthly, worldly. It's sensual, it's animal-like, and it's demonic. It comes from Satan. Does that make sense? That's the nature of it. What kind of things does it do? You tell me. What would be going on in the person's life that makes you realize they don't have wisdom from God, they have wisdom from Satan? Envy? Self-seeking? What does self-seeking mean?
Putting someone as selfish as put me.
It's going to be my way or it's going to be the highway. You're going to do it. I'm going to insist it always please me. It's always going to work out in my favor. Yeah. Boasting and lying and bitterness. You ever see that in a church? You ever see that in a family? There's bitterness, there's anger, there's envy, there's my way or it's not going to happen. Here's the result. There is confusion and every evil work. What does that mean?
Anything that's produced by the one's prior envy, bitterness, self-seeking, boasting, and lying would be the results of that.
All right.
Against God's word.
That is correct. Anybody have a different translation for the word confusion there?
The NLT says you'll find disorder in every,
Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. Say it again.
there you will find disorder in every kind of.
Disorder, chaos. You ever see in a family where there's just chaos in the family? You ever see in a local church where there's just chaos? There's no system of order. It's just disruption and chaos and tell you where that comes from, following the wrong wisdom because somebody is self-seeking and there's bitter envy and confusion and every kind of evil thing. With that attitude, I don't think it's saying there is every evil thing. In other words, if there is this attitude, therefore I know that person is an adulterer and a homosexual and a thief and an idolater. That's not what he's saying. But the person who has this attitude has the same attitude as the thief, idolater, homosexual, etc. They're apt to do anything. So don't be surprised when in the family there's all of this confusion, disorder, and there's this spirit. If there's not other sins going on, don't be surprised if that's not happening in the church too. Does that make sense? All right, let's go further. Let's see what else the text says here. There is the wisdom that's from above, verses 17 and 18. Now let's look at its nature in contrast. Let's get verses 17 and 18. I think we have time to do this and finish the chapter. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy, good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. All right, so let's look here. First of all, the nature. It's heavenly as opposed to earthly. It's spiritual as opposed to being carnal and animal-like. It's God-like in contrast to being demonic. It's pure and peaceable. That's the nature of this wisdom. What kind of things go on in the life of this person? Well, they're pure, they're seeking peace, they're gentle. What's the idea of gentleness here? Reasonable, fair. Now, remember the other one, they're self-seeking? The self-seeking person is never reasonable. Have you ever noticed that? They're never reasonable. They're not fair. This person is reasonable and fair. They're gentle. They're also willing to yield. What does that suggest? Not always my way. They're open to reason. I'm open to reason, is the attitude. Persuadable. Verse 17. And they're showing mercy. They're not partial. And without hypocrisy. How would partiality play into this? Well, yeah, treat everybody the same. But do you think the person who's self-seeking is going to show favoritism to those that are in agreement with him? Yeah, especially in a church. And do things for them that he wouldn't do for someone that opposes his opinion? Now here's the results. There's peace and good works and righteousness. Let's finish with verse 18 to finish that up. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Questions or comments on verse 18? Then we'll open it up for the rest of it. We got about a minute and a half to go. I meant to look up another translation on verse 18. Somebody got a different translation that reads on verse 18.
Well, the NLT says, and those who are peacemakers will plant seeds of peace and reap a harvest of righteousness.
All right, there's one I was looking for. Say it, read that again loud for everybody to hear.
And those who are peacemakers will plant seeds of peace and reap a harvest of righteousness.
All right, very good. Here's the NIV says, peacemakers who sow peace reap a harvest of righteousness. I like that. Don't like the translation. I like the summary there, though. Make sense? Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. Those who are not self-seeking will reap righteousness. Questions or comments on the use of wisdom, controlling the tongue? All right, question number 7, practical lessons you take home with you. Let's get a couple of those and we'll be done. Think before you speak. Very good. What else? All right. Very good. What else? Very good. If there's confusion going on, we may need to see if we're using the right source of wisdom. Very good. What else?
Johnny, I think in controlling the tongue, when you're a Christian, people know you're a Christian. They watch you 24/7. And you can tear it down in just a few minutes when it can take years.
Good point. Tear it down in no time. Not everyone's cut out to be a teacher. Teaching is serious business. I learned that from verse 1, verse 13. Things that seem to be so small and innocent can do great harm, verse 5. We're going to stop on that note, James 4, next time.